Today's book in the series of Rabbi Sacks's book club is The Great Partnership, subtitled Science, Religion, and the Search for Meaning. What I'd like to do is divide my presentation into a couple of parts. First, a little bit of background from Rabbi Sacks himself in this book. It's one of the longer ones. I didn't know that when I picked it. I think it's the longest one of all of them that any of my rabbinic colleagues are doing. But it's wide ranging. There's a lot going on in this book, and what I'd like to do is some of it is personal, some of it is Rabbi Sacks sharing his personal journey, both philosophical and religious. So I'd like to start there. Well, he grew up a very traditional upbringing, Jewishly, but not observant, certainly not scholarly, and yet that's the direction that he ended up in. So I'd like to spend some time about Rabbi Sacks the man, based on his explanations, in the book itself. Then I'd like to move on from there to share with you a video that is in some ways a wonderful synopsis, a review for those of us who read the book, and a synopsis for some of you who may not have read it or finished it, on the main topics, on the salient points of the major thesis of his book, The Great Partnership, the role of science and religion as being complementary, not in any way conflicting. And then after the video, to share with you some of the other points that emerge. There's lots of lists in this book, The Great Partnership. Rabbi Sacks gives five reasons for religion, five challenges that modern religion faces, and I'd like to go through some of them because I found it fascinating. It's helpful that even though it's a long book, oftentimes when the way it's edited, when he wants to make a point for us to remember, he puts it in italics. So I just went back and reminded myself of a lot of those salient and main points through the book, because of the way that it's set up in somewhat of a user-friendly way. So let's start. Rabbi Sacks points out that he himself was always interested in philosophy. He studied at Cambridge and then in Oxford, but he says that philosophy, the discipline of philosophy in universities in the late 60s and early 70s, what he called had reached a dead end, that it had shifted its focus to meanings of words, and it had given up on what he calls the big questions. It asked, what is right and wrong? What does the word right mean? What does the word wrong mean? What does the word morality mean? Right? And many times unwilling to give answers to the big questions of why do right? Why avoid doing wrong? What does it all mean? It became like a syntax, vocabulary lessons and exercises. And at that point, as much as it was an enjoyable and a home for him intellectually, Rabbi Sacks began to realize, back then Jonathan, the student, Jonathan Sacks realized that the wisdom that he sought could only be found in religion, not in philosophy. And because, as he puts it, science may be universal, but meaning is not. We have to ascribe meaning. We have to search for meaning. And that's what he does. Before he contextualizes this search for him, not only in terms of what was going on in the academic ivory towers of Cambridge and Oxford at the time, but also other events of that period, specifically 1967 and the Six-Day War, or more specifically, the events leading up to the Six-Day War, and a crisis of faith and a crisis in human beings, as he puts it, that he felt during that time. Not so much the jubilation of the victory that Israel had, a stunning, miraculous victory over her enemies, but the lead up, when there was a real sense of danger and foreboding, when Israel's enemies surrounded her from all sides, and there was this real concern that so soon after the Holocaust, there was a fear of a second Holocaust. and that Israel, the state of Israel, will be annihilated. And as Rabbi Sacks puts it, those who lived through that time, especially those who lived through that time with a sense of searching for meaning, especially searching for meaning within Judaism and in their Jewish identity, as he puts it, for him and many like him, nothing would be the same again. Especially, the combination of the foreboding, the danger that Israel, the Jewish people, found themselves in, plus the failure of philosophy to answer the big questions. And so, along those lines, talking about the Holocaust, one of the quotes, and there's many. It's an incredible. If for nothing else, it's worth looking at the further readings in the back of this volume, just to give you a sense of the breadth of Rabbi Sacks's Rabbi Sacks's library. We're talking about the books that he wrote, but the books in his library are extensive and the sources are incredibly varied. So he along these lines of sort of the crisis in human beings, the fact that human beings could conduct themselves in such evil ways, he quotes George Steiner, who said, quote, "We know now," talking about the period of World War II and the Holocaust, "that a man can read Goethe and Rilke in the evening, play and listen to Bach and Schubert in the evening, and go on his day's work at Auschwitz in the morning." Right? The idea that high culture, that philosophy and art and literature and people who are considered to be cultured can do things that are incredibly immoral, and that's stuck with young Jonathan Sacks, especially because, as he puts it, he has always sought God in human beings, in finding the uniqueness of the Tzelem Elokim, of the image of God, found in in human beings. As he puts it, quote, "who seem to point to something or someone beyond themselves." Right? The greatest, for him, the greatest proof for God is people who act valiantly, people who self-sacrifice, people who act in an absolute benevolent fashion, in some way mirroring our understanding of the great being of Hashem, of God. And when people act in that way, when they act in a way that connects them to something beyond themselves and to some cause beyond their immediate needs, that's where Rabbi Sacks feels he experiences and sees God the most. So, of course, when human beings fail each other, and not only fail each other, but are cruel towards each other, and really act in human ways towards each other, that also leads to a crisis in faith and wondering, how could that be, and what is it all about? And so in the around that time, soon thereafter, in the late 60s, one summer, young Jonathan went on a tour of America and North America, Canada, and the United States. And he traveled from city to city, meeting with rabbis, and, as he puts it, asking the big questions. And he says that two rabbis' names kept coming up in these conversations, in these meetings that he had. One was Rav Soloveitchik, and the other one was Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And so he made it a point to seek out both of these rabbis who were in their prime in the late 60s, to spend time with them, to have a meeting one-on-one. Rabbi Sacks doesn't speak much about, at least in this book, about his meeting with Rav Soloveitchik, doesn't go into any details, although he does say that it was 2 hours of the most intellectual passion and depth, something that he hadn't seen, a degree to which he's never seen in the academy, in the university in England. And he talks a little bit more about his meeting with the Lubavitcher Rebbe. He shared this story at a gathering of Chabad emissaries as well. But as he puts it in the book, the meeting was divided into two. In the first half of the meeting, he asked Rabbi Schneerson a number of questions. And then in the second half of the meeting, unlike the meeting with Rav Soloveitchik, the Lubavitcher Rebbe asked young Jonathan Sacks a number of questions. And many of those questions were related to the experience of being a Jewish student on the university campuses that Jonathan Sacks was familiar with. What was it like to be a student at Cambridge, at Oxford? How many of those students were observant, were traditional? How many of them were keeping kosher and Shabbat? And when young Jonathan didn't really have all the answers, he explained to him, the Rebbe explained to Jonathan Sacks, we're losing Jews, and each of us has to do something about it. And another famous line from that conversation that Rabbi Sacks has quoted many times was when he was discussing about his situation on campus and his sort of the challenges that he was facing. He told Rabbi Schneerson, the situation that I find myself in is such and such. And the Rebbe immediately stopped him and said, you don't find yourself in a situation, you place yourself in a situation. Right? You don't say that things just happen because you just found yourself there. No, you placed yourself there. You can place yourself in a different situation. You have to take responsibility and proaction to better your place and you better yourself and to contribute in the ways as best you can. As afterwards, in retrospect, Rabbi Sacks said that these two meetings were transformative to the trajectory of his life. As he puts it, Rav Soloveitchik challenged Rabbi Sacks to think, and the Lubavitcher Rebbe challenged Rabbi Sacks to lead. And often he pointed out about the unique leadership of the Lubavitcher Rebbe when he made popular the quote that good leaders create followers and great leaders create leaders. And that's what the Lubavitcher Rebbe did. He created leaders, not just followers. And so that created that summer and these meetings with many rabbis, but especially the Rebbe and the Rav, led to a complete change. He shifted from philosophy to Torah studies, Judaic studies, studying them in an intensive way that he had not done beforehand. He begins these studies in 1973. 5 years later, he's ordained as a rabbi, and 13 short years later, he became chief rabbi of the United Kingdom of Britain. And so that's the trajectory that he talks about and lays out sort of the interest that he has in this topic of religion in general and the good that religion provides and the way that religion can complement science, not just natural sciences, but the human sciences as well, which I think is important to note. There is specifically the inspiration for writing this book. He notes on page 267 was an incident in January of 2009. Rabbi Sacks says that at that time, in January of 2009, the British Humanist Association paid for advertisements to be stuck on buses in London, and the advertisements, I think they call them advertisements in England, right? So those advertisements said, quote, "There's probably no God. Now stop worrying and enjoy life." Rabbi Sacks took tremendous issue with this. That was the inspiration for writing his treatise, and he took issue with both parts of that statement. Number one, as it relates to the probability question, there's probably no God, right? So Rabbi Sacks took issue with that because who says we should live our lives based on probability? Shouldn't we live our lives based on possibility, not just probability? Isn't discovery remaining open to that which is improbable? Isn't that the scientific quest for knowledge? Things might be improbable, but that doesn't mean that they're impossible. And especially the discoveries of the last century teach us that keep an open mind. Just because it's improbable doesn't mean it's impossible. And furthermore, Rabbi Sacks argues on the very notion that atheists don't believe in the improbable, right? If atheists believe that our existence or the existence of the universe, of the world, or life form and human life is all an accident, right? There's no meaning. There's no creator, and therefore there's no meaning out of all this. How do we come about? It's just a series of billions of improbabilities, right? So that was his inspiration for writing this book. In many ways, a defense of religion, especially to the claims that are made by some scientists, by atheists who speak of who suggest that religion is somehow does not work in a complementary fashion with scientific discovery, with the highest echelons of philosophy, with what we know about what science tells us about the world in which we live in. And he fights against it in a number of ways, many of which relate to the question of, many of which want to highlight the great partnership, that it's not an either or, it's both. Science and religion have to come together to work together to create the big picture of what life means, and to answer questions. What I'd like to do now is share with you. You might have seen, if you haven't seen this video, it's really a wonderful. Hold on one second. It's really a wonderful video that it's 7 minutes long. Let's go here. Let's go here. Can someone give me a thumbs up if they can see the video? Okay. There we go.
At various times in history, including now, people have thought that there was a conflict between religion and science. At the time of Galileo, when religion was the stronger of the two, religious belief was used to reject science. Today, when science is stronger, it's sometimes used to reject religion. In fact, though, this whole idea is mistaken. Religion and science are completely different things, and neither negates the other. They're as unlike as poetry and prose, or song and speech, or a portrait of a person and an MRI scan. The human mind is capable of doing two quite different things. One is the ability to break things down into their constituent parts and see how they mesh and interact. This is often called left brain thinking, and the best example is science. The other, often called right brain thinking, is the ability to join events together so that they tell a story, or to join people together so that they form relationships. The best example of this is religion. To put it at its simplest, science takes things apart to see how they work. Religion puts things together to see what they mean. And we need them both, the way we need the two hemispheres of the brain. Science is about explanation. Religion is about interpretation. Science analyzes. Religion integrates. Science breaks things down to their component parts. Religion binds people together in relationships of trust. Science tells us what is. Religion tells us what ought to be. Science describes. Religion inspires, beckons, calls. Science practices detachment. Religion is the art of attachment, self to self, soul to soul. Science sees the underlying order of the physical world. Religion hears the music beneath the noise. Science is the conquest of ignorance. Religion is the redemption of solitude. One way of seeing the difference is to think about their relationship with time. Science looks for causes of events, and a cause always comes before its effect. How did the window break? Because I threw a stone at it. First came the throwing of the stone, then came the breaking of the window. Science looks back from effect to cause. However, human action is always looking forward. Why did I throw the stone? Because I wanted to wake someone who is asleep to warn them that the building next door is on fire. An action always seeks to bring about something in the future. And that's where religion comes in as our deepest guide to the future, the promised land, the messianic age, the vision of the prophets we travel toward when we work for a world in which people finally recognize the image of God in the people not like them, and so bring an end to violence and war. Or sometimes it's about eternal life and the destiny of the soul after death. Either way, religion isn't about causes, but about purposes. Why then do we need science? Because we need to understand the world if we're to honor God's purposes within it. We need to understand disease if we're to cure it. We need to understand the causes of poverty if we're to alleviate it. We need to understand our destructive drives if we're to rise above them. And why do we need religion? Because that's what gives human life its meaning and purpose. The universe is more than the result of an accidental fluctuation in the quantum field at the dawn of time. Human life is more than the unintended consequence of random genetic mutations blindly sifted by natural selection. Just as there's something within us that's beyond the purely physical, so there's something within the universe, we call it the divine presence, that's beyond the merely material. And just as God created the universe in love, justice, and compassion, so he calls on us to create relationships of love, justice, and compassion. Or to put it another way, the difference between religion and science is the difference between the impersonal and the personal. When you treat impersonal phenomena as if they were persons, the result is myth. Light is the sun god, rain is the sky god, natural disasters are battles between the gods, and so on. Science was born when people stopped telling stories about nature and instead observed it. In other words, when they relinquished myth. And when you treat persons impersonally, as if they were objects, the result is dehumanization. People categorized by color, class, or creed, and treated differently as a result. The religion of the Bible was born when people stopped seeing people as useful or useless objects and began to see each individual as unique, sacrosanct, the image of God. So we need both religion and science. Albert Einstein said it most famously, science without religion is lame. Religion without science is blind. We need science to understand the universe and religion to guide our way within it, from the world as it is to the world as it ought to be, a world of peace, justice, compassion, and love, when we, God's creations, honor God, our Creator.
Definitely wanted to give credit to that video. It sums up a lot of the book itself, but and so it's a great piece if you read the book as a review. If you didn't read the book, to whet your appetite to read more of it. I wanted to go over some not the points from the video, but some that are related to it. A number of Rabbi Sacks's lists in the book, in this book, a number of times he'll give five reasons for something. So I'd like to go, or 3 reasons for this, and I found it very very memorable. And so I wanted to share with the remaining 10 minutes or so. I wanted to share with you some of some of Rabbi Sacks's lists. So, for instance, Rabbi Rabbi Sacks lists at one point in the book 5 things that happen when society loses its religion. 5 things that happen when society loses its religion, which is part of why he wrote this book, is because of the ascendance of not just atheism, as he puts it, but militant atheism, which he says is similarly dangerous as militant religion, fanaticism, but nonetheless, the absence of religion is a danger and leads to a number of things that we lose, society as a whole. Number one, it's a loss in the belief of human dignity and the sanctity of life. It says that support structures become undone, life becomes disposable, and we lose that notion of sanctity of life. Secondly, with the loss of religion comes a loss of what Rabbi Sacks calls the politics of covenant. Politics of covenant is the notion of collective responsibility, that we do things for the greater good, a common good. And instead of the politics of covenant, Rabbi Sacks says it's replaced with a covenant of contract, a quid pro quo. States supply services, and in return, they collect taxes. And people become cynical about politics because they know that politicians will just promise them more services or less taxes. But it's not about collective responsibility. It's not about creating a common good. You know, the notion of sacrifice, of patriotism, falls by the wayside when in the absence of religion. Thirdly, the absence of the loss of religion on a societal level leads to a loss of morality. Not that you have to be immoral, if you're an atheist, but nonetheless, words become less meaningful, says Rabbi Sacks. Words like duty and obligation, honor and integrity, loyalty and trust, right? Similar to what he mentioned about philosophy, the discipline of philosophy in the 60s and 70s. Instead of understanding what these concepts mean and how they benefit our lives, you spend your time wondering if there's any meaning to these words at all, or if they're completely relative in a postmodern era when there is no such thing as truth. Truth is subjective, is always in the eyes of the beholder. You begin to lose the meaning of these types of connection and obligation. Fourthly, he mentions that loss of religion in society leads to the loss of the institution of marriage. Relationships are no longer consecrated. There's no longer that sense of commitment and obligation and honor. Fewer people get married and more marriages end in divorce. And number 5, the diminishing of religion in our society leads to the loss of the possibility of a meaningful life. After all, in secular culture, the possibility of a meaningful life is a personal project, right? So that's possible. But the loss of the possibility of a meaningful life, that comes from outside of us. One of the things that's not mentioned in that video is one of Rabbi Sacks's proofs for the existence of God is that the meaning of an idea has to come from outside of that idea. So the meaning of the universe can't be found in exploring the universe. It has to come from outside the universe. He says that's a concept he learned from one of his philosophy teachers, that the meaning of a system has to come from beyond or outside that system, not the rules. He says, for instance, if you want to know what is baseball, so you can read the rule book about baseball. You don't really learn about baseball, what it really means, without understanding what teamwork means and what being a fan means, and the tradition and the history and the memories that people have of going to baseball games with loved ones and parents and children. You don't understand it from within it. You have to look from outside. He says that's true about the universe. And without religion, the universe, Rabbi Sacks says, is silent. There is no calling. There is no greater meaning towards a meaningful existence. As he points out, Tolstoy, the author Tolstoy, came to this conclusion as well, that science and philosophy can't provide answers for why life is worth living. Only religion can provide those answers. Rabbi Sacks also quotes a sociologist by the name of Philip Rieff, who wrote a book, A History of Civilization, who divides history of civilization into three periods: fate, faith, and fiction. The age of fate, says Rief, as Rabbi Sacks admits that he's utilizing this construct for his purposes. The age of fate is everything is in the hands of the gods. Everything has meaning, but we are powerless, and the gods are controlling everything. The age of fiction is a postmodern condition, that there is no such thing as meaning. Meaning is invented, is subjective. There's no such thing as objective truth. Nothing has inherent meaning. So you go, on one end is the age of fate, where everything has meaning. On the other end is the age of fiction, where really nothing has meaning. And in between, Rief says the period in between is the age of faith, F-A-I-T-H. Rabbi Sacks says that's the age that Judaism came on the scene, that monotheism, through Avraham, through Abraham, came on the scene. The age of faith gives us the concept of covenant. And that it's not that everything has meaning, it's not that nothing has meaning. Meaning is what we come to and we create meaning that's not just discovered, but it is also created. Rabbi Sacks says we create meaning in three ways: through the stories we tell, through the rituals we perform, and through the prayers that we say. Of course, we're coming off of Pesach, so two of these, all three of them, prayer is more general, but stories and rituals are very much part of what Pesach is, and why it's so meaningful through the story we tell and through the rituals we perform. So Judaism brought us to the age of faith and allows us to navigate even through this postmodern era where the age of fiction, as we have to call it. Now, Rabbi Sacks, one of the things that's so intriguing and accessible about the book is that Rabbi Sacks admits that there are challenges to religion. The first set of challenges that he mentions is three challenges to religion. The questions on religion. Number one, how can a good God allow suffering in this world? Number two, how can religious people commit evil in the name of God? How can evil exist? How can humans perpetrate evil against each other? And lastly, the clash between science and religion. So I'm going to talk about the clash first, because that's sort of how we get to the great partnership, is resolving the clash that people may think exists between science and religion. Rabbi Sacks quotes an episode that in 1796, Napoleon asked a certain philosopher, "Where is God in your scientific system?" To which the philosopher Laplace, I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce it, said, quote, "I have no need for that hypothesis." And Darwin, in some ways, is the greatest challenge to religious faith, right? Because Darwin says everything happened by chance. There is no great meaning or overall purpose. Our faith, monotheism, is based on meaningfulness of the human condition. And Darwinism, as understood by atheists and used sometimes, or sort of, as Rabbi Sacks suggests, Darwin is misquoted. But Darwin is often associated with this idea of everything is random. That we got to this point out of a million random selections that happened, and therefore life is purposeless and meaningless. But Rabbi Sacks, as he says many times, that the presence or the absence of science can't that is not what can't be as the sense of meaning can't be established by science, right? Because after all, science answers the question of what, but religion answers the question of why. And in fact, Rabbi Sacks turns it on Darwin on his head in some ways. Atheists like to use Darwin as a source of proof to the randomness, meaninglessness, the eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die and there's no purpose in life attitude. Rabbi Sacks says, no, there's something else in Darwin. He points out this number five ways that Darwin is supportive of religion. Number one, because Darwin taught us the diversity of the planet, of the universe, and that God delights in diversity. Number two, that the Creator made creation creative. That is to say, the idea of evolution means that is very much in line with a statement we say every morning in the brachot before Shema, Hamachadesh b'tuvo b'chol yom tamid, Maseh Bereshit, that there's a dynamic element in creation, that it's not just renewed, but it's developed. That very much fits in with the notion of the evolution within species over time. That life, that our universe is not static. It continues to evolve and be dynamic. A third idea that we learned from Darwin that we can use for religion is we now know that all life draws from a single source. That very much fits in with our understanding of the Genesis story. Right? There's one act of creation, and from there, the world developed. And similarly, as Rabbi Sacks puts it, the Genesis story and science converge on the same metaphor. Life is linguistic. As he puts it, the mystics understand that creation, God created the world through speech, through different permutations of his name. That on a mystical level, everything is God, just with God's name in different permutations. Well, Rabbi Sacks says, isn't that what DNA taught us? That all of humanity, all of life, is really different permutations of the same basic structure of DNA. Also, we learned about the interconnectedness of all of life, which is a very Jewish concept. Why is man, Adam and Chava, commanded and challenged to protect the world and the universe? Because they are the culmination of that process. But we all have a common origin. Life and plants, animals and humans, we're not all the same. But we have a common origin. As far as the other challenges to religion, how can there be a God who we consider to be good, and yet there be evil in the world? Rabbi Sacks says all of the traditional answers, if there is evil, then there must not be a good God, or if there's a good God, then what we see as evil may not be evil. Right? Those are all partial answers. He says the real answer is to live with that tension, right? That there is a God that exists and there is evil that exists. And the more powerfully, Rabbi Sacks says, the more powerfully I feel God's existence, the more strongly I protest the existence of evil. Why does evil exist in the world? I heard this in one of the eulogies for Rabbi Sacks, one of the tributes. Why does evil exist in the world? So that human beings can protest it. So that human beings can do what they can to eradicate it, to do their part, not to accept it. Like Avraham, that model, right, with Sodom, not to accept the destruction, but to protest against it. And when it comes to human beings perpetrating evil in the name of religion, right, that's not really a problem with religion. We all know that's a problem with human beings, right? That's a problem with human beings. And why are those problems with religion? So Rabbi Sacks notes that there are a number of hazards that all religions have. And it has to do with hard texts, right? Verses in the Torah or in the Holy Book that require interpretation. Judaism has it, and in some ways, the interpretative tradition in Christianity and Islam is not as developed, which can explain the religious fanaticism among some, where they don't have this interpretative tradition to help explain difficult texts. The notion. So there are challenges that religion, that religion as experienced or lived by human beings presents, but nonetheless, the alternative is to seal our fate in a world that has no meaning, that has no purpose, that has no why. And that's not a world that most of us would want to live in. we mentioned that originally, that billboard on the buses, there probably is no God, right? So stop worrying and enjoy your life. So we know that Rabbi Sacks takes issue with the idea of probability. Life is about possibility, not about probability. But he also takes issue with the idea that to reject religion or to move on with an atheistic perspective is the way that we enjoy life. He says, no, in fact, where do we experience joy? We experience joy through our faith, right? That faith is not about worrying. Faith is about joy and celebration, gratitude and praise. And he points out that as societies, he uses Europe, the one he's most familiar with, as societies have become more secular, they have become more depressed. Right? The rates of depression have gone up with the decline in organized religion. Religion makes you happy. It gives you a sense of real happiness, comfort, a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose, a sense of hope. So I just wanted to conclude with the cases that Rabbi Sacks, towards the end of his book, makes the cases for religion. Number one, the universe, the creation. Even now, physicists talk about the moment of creation, right? And they can't really explain why it happened then. We accept what the physicists and the astrophysicists and the biologists have to say. We just are able to explain, to introduce and interject God that explains that moment, and everything else is in consonance with one another. So the universe having a beginning, that's been proven by science, and that's a case for God and religion. The argument of life, Darwinism itself, it doesn't, if you interject God with Darwinism, right, the evolution of the species, the complexity and the diversity of organisms, that ends up becoming a case for God and religion, right? And even if you understand, even if you want to,
Rabbi Weinstock brother about Sacks.
even if you wanted to accept the notion of evolution among the species, you're still left with the question: how did you end up with the human species? A species that's self-conscious, that's capable of thinking and reflecting, of remembering and asking why. All of these things are not found in any other species, and it's difficult to understand how that would have developed through evolution. That particular point, the argument that can be made from history for the existence of God and the case for religion. How probable, going back to probability, was it that there would be a person in history like Abraham, who became the most influential man in history? 6 billion people on this planet follow a religion that has him at its roots. And more specifically, the Jewish people. How probable is it that we, the Jewish people, such a small minority who has been displaced from our homeland and persecuted in so many places, have such an influence and still exist today, right? The story is told that Frederick the Great asked his physician, can you name one single proof to the existence of God? And his physician answered 2 words: the Jews. And lastly, this argument from happiness, from meaning, from a sense of purpose, for answering the why, can only be done by religion and not by science. In the epilogue, and with this will end, in the epilogue, Rabbi Sacks has a letter to a scientific atheist. I don't know if it's a real letter or just the way he ends. And he points out that science serves 3 functions that are central to monotheism. Number 1, science diminishes human ignorance. Number 2, science increases human power. Knowledge is power. And number 3, science helps exemplify in us what the qualities that God has imbued within our soul. Number 1, God wants us to know and understand, just like he is all knowing and all understanding. God wants us to exercise responsible freedom. We have free will. And God wants us to use our intellectual gifts that he has given us. And so therefore, that doesn't necessarily explain why scientists should be religious. although many scientists have become religious, especially in the 21st century. But it does explain why we, as religious Jews, should respect science, something that has been very relevant over the course of this pandemic. And the purpose of this book, as Rabbi Sacks puts in his epilogue, is to show that religious faith is not absurd. Religion is a different perspective, but is not incompatible with science. It's complementary. He admits that atheism is not an untenable stance towards the world that we experience, but and Rabbi Sacks admits that he has learned much from atheists, especially his philosophy teachers, and they've taught him a lot about religion, of all things. But nonetheless, religion, science can't have the answers to why. Science can't have the answers to those big questions. That's not its field. It's the other half of the brain, as that video showed us. The right brain, not the left brain. And Rabbi Sacks also in the epilogue points out that there are too many extreme and angry voices already, almost 10 years ago when this book was published, on the scientific side and the atheistic side and on the religious side. And he points out that even on the religion side, there are too many, quote, angry people invoking God to justify their anger. And Rabbi Sacks just ends by pointing out that the problems are complex, right? The changes that have come about in the last 20 years through technology are immense, and they really have reshuffled the world order. These challenges are intense and immense, but they can only be solved not only through science, not only through religion, but through, as he calls it, this great partnership between the two, working together, respecting one another, recognizing the limitations of one another, of religion and science, recognizing that there are two different disciplines and two different areas of inquiry, and not meant to compete with one another, but to complement one another. I found this although it's a philosophical book, it's written in a way that's accessible, in a way that leaves you wanting more, gives you a lot of further readings, both in the Jewish tradition and the general philosophy realm. And it's a reminder to me. It's a wonderful testament to what we call Torah Umada, what we call Torah and science, Torah and general knowledge, that they're meant to complement each other. In the natural sciences, they absolutely complement each other, but even in the realm of philosophy and literature, they help us understand one another. They don't have to be in conflict. They can very much be in consonance, and so that's a comforting thought in an era and a time when our politics are so divided, when people are so divided, when it seems that everything's either or. It's nice to read Rabbi Sacks's introduction of complexity, of nuance, of gray, of saying that it's not either or, it's both, and the challenge is understanding how we live with both and complement both as we move on, carrying Rabbi Sacks's legacy. See a question here: did Rabbi Sacks ever discuss Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning? Absolutely. He does mention. He mentions it. He mentions it in this book about that as it relates to both meaning and as it relates to the fundamental notion of free will, right? That human beings are defined by their ability to choose, and as Frankl teaches us, even when seemingly all of our choices have been taken away from us, there's still that ability to choose, and that is fundamentally a human capacity. It's one of the ways in which we emulate God, right? Because God has that ability to choose, and we have that ability to choose. Granted, there's that philosophical question of divine foreknowledge and human action, but that's he deals with that too. Rabbi Sacks, it's an all-encompassing type of book. But yes, he does deal with the search for meaning just as Rabbi Sacks has a search for meaning that brought about his book. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. The last edition of this series is May 26th. Mark your calendars after Shavuot, right before the end of the month, next month, when Rabbi Adam Starr will be reviewing and presenting on Rabbi Sacks's book, A Letter in the Scroll. If there are any questions, feel free to unmute yourself or add it to the chat. But I thank you so much for learning with me, for allowing me the opportunity to share with you some of Rabbi Sacks's ideas that were particularly meaningful for me.
Thank you, Rabbi.
You're welcome.
Very interesting.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you. Have a good night, Rabbi.
You're welcome. Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Have a
Be
wonderful
well.
evening.
Be well.
Bye. Be well, everyone. Good night.
Good night.